record. All righty.
Awesome, thank you. So I was just saying to folks that the automated captioning we're using today may not always capture what I'm saying accurately. So please use the chat feature to ask any clarifying questions regarding my narration. I will pause after each major section of my presentation just to check in and make sure everyone has the information they need. I've shared a link in the chat, and I'll go ahead and share it again just in case it doesn't show up for the folks that just joined us. This link, bit.ly/OWHE-PRES, P-R-E-S, should take you to an accessible published Google Doc version of my slide content. So that being said, hi, welcome to the nuts and bolts of building accessible presentations. I have an image here on my slide of a stream of nuts and bolts leading to a collection of 4 symbols: a person using a wheelchair, a human brain, hands signing ASL, and a person walking with a cane. These are just a couple of symbols meant to represent physical and cognitive access. Other relevant information: my name is Michele Joy Bromley. I am the IT Accessibility and Content Lead out of the Office of Information Technology at Portland State University. My primary directive in that role is to provide accessibility training and support to PSU staff who are building public-facing digital content or procuring new technologies. I train folks how to build accessible digital content in a variety of authoring platforms and formats. Today, we're talking about building accessible presentations. So our focus will primarily be on the actual presentation materials and how to build them in a way that is accessible and shareable to all audiences. But we'll also spend a little bit of time at the end talking about how to make the presentation experience itself as accessible as possible. You'll note that I described the image here on my first slide. We'll talk about this a little more later in the presentation, but I described this image because it was contextually relevant. There may be additional decorative images in my presentation that have no relevant content or function, and I will not be describing these images as a part of my presentation. All right, so what's the agenda? I love answering questions. So what makes a presentation accessible? And what do I mean when I use the word accessibility? Why? Why is presentation accessibility so critical? That's an easy one, and I think you'll all be on board. And how? And this is where we'll spend most of our time. How do you make presentations accessible? And we'll be talking about the materials, yes, because those are critical and they'll take the most work, but we'll also talk about you, how you can be more accessible as a presenter. And that doesn't take as much work, but it does take forethought, and it involves a little bit more awareness in the moment. So here we go. What makes a presentation accessible? When I use the word accessibility in this context, in the context of dissemination of information through digital means, we're talking websites, e-newsletters, PDF flyers, PowerPoint presentations. I mean literal, equitable, meaningful access for all users, including people with visual, auditory, motor, or cognitive disabilities. As a presenter, you don't know who in your audience might have a disability or who might simply access and process content differently than you do. You don't know who might depend on equitable access visually, auditorily, tactily, using adaptive technology. Digital information has the unique capacity to be accessible to anyone as long as it's designed with everyone in mind. When folks hear the word accessibility in relation to digital content, they often think of it as a synonym for availability. And in the context of people presenting digital content, they might think of accessibility as a synonym for approachability. But here we're talking literal, meaningful access. You might show a presentation on a screen or send your slides to a group of people via email, but if they're not designed to be accessible to all audiences, it won't matter that the information is available. It's not accessible. Okay, so why is accessibility in this context, or really in any context, so critical? Why should you make an effort to build and give presentations that are fully accessible? I don't think I need to spend too much time on the why, because I think you're all already on board. But I'll give you the 2-minute elevator pitch now. And if you want to learn more, let's chat. I love people and I love talking about accessibility. I'll be sharing my contact information at the end of the presentation. I like the way Steve Krug put it in his book, A Common Sense Approach to Web Usability. He said it's the right thing to do. And not just the right thing, it's profoundly the right thing to do, because the one argument for accessibility that doesn't get made nearly often enough is how extraordinarily better it makes some people's lives. How many opportunities do we have to dramatically improve people's lives just by doing our job a little better? Basically, there are over 1 billion people in the world with disabilities. 1 in 4 people in the US identify as having a disability. This translates to over 61 million people. And the vast majority of digital content, including webinars and digital presentation content, is not accessible to people with disabilities. Not because it's not possible, but because digital content is just not consistently designed with accessibility in mind. So let's do things differently. Any questions on the what and why before we jump into the how? And you can pop your questions in the chat, and any other time that I open it up for questions, do feel free, especially in a smaller group like this, to unmute, and you can also ask questions verbally. All right. Well, this is it, folks. After all of my initial rambling, how do you make a presentation accessible? Well, as I indicated earlier, it's you and your content. Content is harder, so we're going to start there. Making presentation content accessible. First, software. How are you delivering your presentation? There are a ton of options out there. I would say the most popular are likely Microsoft PowerPoint and Google Slides, which is what I'm using today. Prezi is another one that is used, which brings me to my first point. Choose an authoring platform that can generate accessible, shareable, usable content. One of the most accessible choices you can make in building a presentation is to create a shareable, accessible version of your presentation to make available to audience members before you begin. I know, not a popular idea. Folks like to surprise, keep people in suspense. And to be fair, many of you only received access to my slide content today, right at the beginning of my presentation. But ultimately, folks might have a hard time following along in the moment. Maybe they missed something and they need to go back to reference a specific slide for a question. Maybe they process best by taking notes, and they shouldn't have to take notes on content that's already available in the slides. This is huge in terms of accessibility and usability. Whether an audience member is using adaptive technology or not, the ability to access your content through alternative means is critical. This is where I note that Prezis are not accessible via screen reading software, which is used by people who are blind. Not to mention the risks to people with seizure disorders. You want to be really careful with animation. Favor more accessible authoring platforms like Microsoft PowerPoint or Google Slides. Microsoft PowerPoint in particular makes it incredibly easy to generate and share accessible, usable content. This is where it's important to note the difference between technical accessibility and usability. I can generate a presentation that is fully accessible in either PowerPoint or Slides, but Google Workspace is still a little tricky to navigate with adaptive technology. So when I choose to create in Google Slides, like I did today, and sometimes that's the most feasible option when you're co-authoring, for example, I make my slides visually accessible, and I could go ahead and share them. They're also programmatically accessible. But instead, I created a nice, fully accessible digital handout containing all of my slide content. A published Google Doc, when designed accessibly, functions similarly to a simple HTML web page. So at minimum, generate an accessible alternative to share with your audience members if your original slide content is not the most usable option for sharing. Consider a digital printable handout that contains all relevant visual content from your presentation. Now, I should note that if you do this, it doesn't excuse you from making your original slide content accessible. You still need to make the Google Slides visually accessible because people are watching and listening to my presentation right now in the present, whether they're accessing a handout separately or not. I just went one step further and made my shareable version a little more usable. All right, so you've picked a mode of delivery. Let's talk theme. Oh, and it looks like I've got a question from Jessica.
Hi, I was wondering if you had thoughts on Canva and its accessibility. I know one thing that we're doing in my office is a lot of people are complaining that Google Slides is like super boring and PowerPoint is boring, and Canva gives you more opportunities to make things pretty and aesthetically appealing. But what is Canva's accessibility compared to the others?
You could make your content visually accessible using Canva. So you could present using Canva, but you would not be able to share that resource in a way that's accessible. Because Canva, unfortunately, is not accessible via screen reading software. There's no way to add the tags that are needed to make it accessible. You have to sort of edit it with Adobe Acrobat Pro to get it where it needs to be. So you could present in Canva, but make all of your slide content available as an accessible digital handout. So it's still really important that all of those visual accessibility components that we're going to be talking about here in a couple minutes are applied in Canva, and then all of the visual and programmatic things that we're going to talk about here would need to be taken into consideration in the accessible alternative.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem. So once you've picked your mode of delivery, you want to talk about theme. When you're in PowerPoint or Google Slides, you need to choose an accessible theme. And if you're using a different tool, all the things we're going to talk about within the context of theme are going to apply in those spaces. You need to consider typography and color for every layout. This is customizable. In PowerPoint, you can manipulate typography and color for all slide layouts at once using the slide master. In Slides, you edit the theme. So for typography, what do you need to think about? Most simply, use a clear, legible font, size 18 point or larger. Here you're thinking about people with cognitive or reading disabilities, for whom a complex, fancy, or serif font might decrease readability significantly or make your content totally inaccessible. So you're also thinking about people with low vision, for whom small text would be problematic. And color. You never use color alone to convey meaning. Again, thinking about people with low vision, but also people who are blind, colorblind, or deafblind. Color can absolutely be used decoratively, but never alone to convey meaning. Imagine transportation information is here in red, lodging information is blue. That chart or graph would be distinctly unhelpful to a lot of people. Also, if you were sharing something like that on screen, using directional cues like here and there and gesticulating toward a screen are not helpful. Someone might be accessing your presentation auditorily. Whatever you see on the slides should be articulated verbally. This is one of the same reasons that we have captioning available. Someone may be accessing your presentation visually, so anything you say should be available as closed captioning. Also, you want to check your color contrast between text and background. This is critical for people with low vision or people who are colorblind. You want your presentations to be dynamic and engaging, so absolutely use color to make that presentation pop. But you really want to make sure that you're using appropriate color contrast. And there are some fantastic tools online for checking color contrast between foreground and background to make sure you're meeting those minimum requirements for people with low vision or color blindness. So, chosen a theme, you've thought about typography and color and kind of edited that for the whole presentation in advance. That's a really good idea, because then each time you create a new slide or add new content, it's going to comply with that theme that you've created with the accessible fonts and the accessible colors. Now you want to use built-in slide layouts when creating new slides, period. This is critical to preserving reading order for those using adaptive technology to access your shareable content. If you don't like the way a specific slide layout appears, modify it in the slide master or theme. Presentations don't allow for the kind of semantic structure that you can build into a web page or electronic document. There's no heading structure to organize your content. And when you input your own custom text boxes onto a blank slide, the reading order for adaptive technology is usually in the order in which elements were inserted into the slide, not the linear top to bottom, left to right order in which you visually arrange things. So it might visually look exactly the way you want, but then someone accesses your slide content using screen reading software, and it's reading all of the different images and text boxes out of order. Whoops, my apologies. I went back a little bit here. You can manually get things in the right programmatic order if you create a custom slide, but it's difficult and a lot of extra work for you that becomes absolutely necessary to facilitate screen reader access for people who are blind. One great method to validate reading order, if you've created custom slides and you're not using those built-in layouts in an accessible authoring program, is to tab into each slide with your keyboard and tab from element to element after you've created the slide. If keyboard focus isn't in the order you intended, you've got some editing to do. So save yourself some trouble and ensure accessible reading order by using the built-in slide layouts. This really helps in terms of consistent navigation. You have your title slide, your main points, your section headers, your title and body slides, like this one. It's really critical for navigation for folks using adaptive technology. You also want to give every slide a unique title. Sometimes when you have a lot to say about a given topic, you might be using several slides that have the same title. You really want to try to split things up into sections and make each of your slide titles unique. It's critical for navigation, particularly for people who are blind and using screen reading software, or people with cognitive or reading disabilities. You also want to use lists, columns, and simple tables to improve readability. You want to use the empty space on your slides appropriately. You've chosen a larger font size, great, but think about your line spacing. Use bulleted and numbered lists. And yes, use tables, but keep them simple and note that they should be used for data only. Do not use tables for visual layout. You want to use the built-in structures like columns. When you use tables for something other than data, the navigation gets really complicated for people using screen reading software. It's like I have a question from Kathy.
Hi, Michelle.
Hi.
A question I have. We do a lot of slides for our board of trustees, and the slides follow an agenda.
Yeah.
The agenda has topics on it. One agenda item might have as many as 5 or 6 slides that relate to it. How it's difficult to come up with unique titles for each of those slides. Would we be better off than just not titling a slide? Or what might you suggest for a situation like that, where again, you really can't necessarily break them down into subtopics, because it's all one topic, but you've got 5 or 6 slides. How can you give me maybe an example of that?
Sure. Yeah. Often in those situations, if you're talking about a lot sort of under the same header, maybe it's budget. One of the items on the agenda is budget, and there's like 6 slides related to the budget. You're showing 6 slides because there's 6 slides worth of information to share. The information is not being repeated from slide to slide. It's different information, but it all has to do with the budget. So often what folks will do is they'll have budget colon student fees, budget colon employee relations, something like that. So just giving each slide, just you're still making it clear that this is a part of this previous section, but here's what's unique about it, which is going to be really helpful for navigation and frankly just provide a lot more clarity for folks who may struggle as visual learners. And so you're engaging with the slides, and it's really nice to have that summary at the top.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so speaking of budgets and Board of Trustees type presentations that often have so many charts and graphs, images. This one is simple. You need to include alternative text for any contextually relevant images. This is critical for those who might be accessing your shareable content with screen reading software. Basically anything that's not decorative. If it has a contextual purpose, describe the basic content and function. Focus on why the image is being included. What's the purpose? And don't overwhelm listeners with detail. Be succinct. That means if you've got a really complex image or graphic, typically the alternative text is going to give a general overview. What's the content and function of having that graph on the slide? What is the presenter trying to point out? This is a graph comparing X and Y with a slope trending more toward increased enrollment in the following year. It's what we're all hoping for. So it describes the basic content and function. And then if this is meant, most of the time, these are meant to be a resource that people take away. And in terms of accessibility, you always want to make your slide content available to folks as an alternative means. So typically in an alt text for a complex graphic, you would also reference where to go for more detail. Reference the link below the image to find a full description, or to access the data table from which this graph was generated. So you want to make sure that there is an alternative means to get all the detail associated with it, but the alt text itself is just going to be a brief description. Consider the screenshot I include on this slide. A small section of bar graph representing 3 of the most common WCAG failures in WebAIM's 2020 analysis of the top 1 million homepages. 86.3% had low contrast, 66% had missing alternative text, and 59.9% had empty links. I'm not going into a lot of detail about where I got this graph from in this context for this alternative text, because this is, if this graph were in a presentation, I would be talking about probably what WCAG is, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, what WebAIM is, Web Accessibility in Mind, and why they did that analysis. Here I'm using it as an example of what kind of alt text I would use were I to include this in a presentation where I'm talking about Web Content Accessibility Guideline failures. As a side note here, you'll note that color is very purposefully not used to convey meaning in this graph. The color of these bars is decorative. Yes, the low contrast bar is red, the missing alternative text bar is blue, and the empty links bar is salmony pink. But that color does not signify any meaning. The labels for each bar are immediately below. There's no separate key where I have to match color somewhere. If there was a separate key that had red, blue, and that salmony color and had the names of the bars, that would not be helpful to me if I were a person with low vision or a person with color blindness, because I wouldn't be able to match the content from the graph with the key. Links. You have to make sure that your links are descriptive, first of all, and that they make sense out of context. People who are blind and use screen reading software often navigate digital environments like your slide content using links or other actionable elements. They might even use their software to pull up a list of links out of context. So you don't want to use phrases like learn more, click here, or more information. And this is a critical accessibility issue everywhere, not just in presentation content, but there are websites where there's 15 different learn more or more information links. And that causes a pretty significant accessibility issue for folks who are using their keyboard navigation to navigate through links. Visible selectable text for a given link should indicate the purpose, the direction in which folks will be sent on selection. And URLs as link text should also be avoided, unless a URL is relevant content in a resource like a presentation, for example, that will be viewed perhaps by those who are not referencing a digital handout because that's not something that they need for access. You might say, please visit PSU's accessibility website, pdx.edu/accessibility for more information. The actual descriptive link is PSU's accessibility website, but I've supplemented with a simplified URL in parentheses since some audience members won't have the shareable version open where they can click on the link, so they need to hear the URL. It also facilitates printability for my shared version if I'm creating a digital resource that I also want to be available in print. So you want to make sure that you've got the actionable descriptive link and then the link in parentheses. If it's a digital resource only, like a website, then you don't need the URL, you just need your descriptive link. We'll touch on this a little bit more later, but notice I articulated the link, as I said, since some audience members will be accessing this presentation auditorily. Looks like I've got a question from Jeanette.
Hi, thank you. What do you suggest for websites with long listings, like for example, Google Sites, for example, you know, with that piece in the parentheses? What do you suggest for something really long?
That is such a great question, because for websites, absolutely, that's one of the reasons why it's so important to have the actual descriptive link name on digital resources. It's why we avoid URLs, because they're long, they're very difficult for someone listening auditorily, also for someone looking at it and trying to retype it. So it's a problem, right, for resources where we need to have our descriptive link, but we also need to include that URL in parentheses, and that's in a presentation or a printable resource. That's pretty important. And what we unfortunately are kind of stuck with in that situation is that we have to figure out how to create a clearer, more accessible redirect. And you have to work with your own school to determine what the most secure options are for your school. As an individual presenter for my own presentation content, I feel comfortable using bit.ly links. So for example, the Google HTML resource that I've shared with all of you, so you have access to my presentation content, is a published Google Doc. The URL is so long. For any of you that have either selected the link from the chat or typed into your browser bit.ly/OWHE pres, P-R-E-S, you've probably noticed that in the address bar, it turned into a ridiculously long URL that would not have been an accessible option for me to include in this presentation. And so, yeah, for the longer links, if you can use bit.ly, but again, if it's in a work setting, I would really check in with your IT office because there may be a different redirect option. We have a couple of different redirect options that we use at PSU, for example, to shorten our URLs. The other thing that you might notice from this slide, as we discussed earlier in the presentation, you want to make sure that active links are not indicated with color alone. So here I indicate a link with both color and an underline. This is best practice since color contrast between links and surrounding text will not always be sufficient to indicate to somebody with low vision or color blindness that something is an actionable item that they can select with their cursor or their keyboard. Videos. Much like the narration for live presentations, any videos you share need captions. Captions should be synchronized, equivalent, and accessible. This means that automated captioning won't be sufficient in the long run. You can use automated captioning as a starting point when you're creating a video, but you'd need to edit the captions to ensure accuracy for both content and timing. Alternatively, you can have a vendor caption for you. Captioning is great because while it is absolutely necessary and critical for people who are deaf or hard of hearing, it's really useful for everyone. Second language learners, people who are older or aging, people who are multitasking. On that note, I'm actually going to share one of the Web Accessibility Initiative's perspective videos titled Video Captions. It's an excellent resource on the way in which accessibility is essential for some and useful for all. So I'm going to check real quick. I've already got captions turned on. I do want to make sure that audio is working. So if I could get a couple of hand raises from folks if we hear audio here in the first couple of seconds.
Web accessibility perspectives. Video captions. Video isn't just about pictures, it's also about sound. Without the audio, you'd have to guess what this film is about. Frustrating, isn't it? Not knowing what's going on. That's the situation for everyone who can't hear. Captions make videos accessible, which is also handy for people who want to watch video in loud environments or where you need to be very, very quiet. Web accessibility, essential for some, useful for all. Visit w3.org/WAI/perspectives for more information on video captions.
And I actually encourage you to check out WAI perspective videos. If you just type WAI perspective videos in your address bar.
And welcome to the Esri GeoDev webinar series.
We're about to listen to another webinar series. My apologies for that. I do encourage you to look them up. There's some really excellent perspective videos, some of which touch on some of the things we're talking about specifically today for accessible presentations. But they're these short, usually around 1-minute videos that talk about the importance of accessible digital design and how it's absolutely critical for people with disabilities, but also incredibly useful for everyone. Really some great resources. So I encourage you to check those out. The great news is that if you already have captions, you likely already have a transcript, or at least it will be a lot easier to generate one. And transcripts are necessary to make videos accessible to people who are deafblind and using a refreshable Braille display. Audio files also require a transcript in order to be accessible to people who are deaf or deafblind. Audio or text descriptions for any undescribed visual content are also necessary to make a video accessible to people who are blind. In many scenarios, this can be accomplished during the design process when you're creating a video through conscious narration. So when you're choosing videos to share in a presentation, just be thinking about whether or not there's any contextually relevant visual content that's not being narrated. And that's something that you would want to look for videos that do have that conscientious narration. And if they don't, to make sure when you present to fill in those gaps and make sure that all of that contextually relevant visual content is being described.
Web accessibility perspectives.
It really wants you to watch another video. Okay, so any questions on the how for building slide content? I know that was a lot of information. All right, well, we'll have a little bit more time for questions after the next section too. Also feel free to enter any questions into the chat or raise your hand as we go. All right, so making yourself accessible. How can you be more accessible as a presenter? We talked about this a little bit throughout the presentation. Share your content in advance. Give your audience multiple means of access because you don't know what kind of access they need. Describe relevant visuals. If you have any non-decorative, contextually relevant images, include alt text in your digital content, yes, but also describe those visuals during the presentation. Speak slowly and clearly. This one is hard for me, even when I don't have a gold, but it's really important for people with cognitive disabilities, people who are hard of hearing, and just people in general. If you're not maintaining awareness, an awareness of your cadence and articulating as clearly as possible, this is important to allow for accurate captioning too. Use a microphone. This one isn't as relevant in a webinar, but it is absolutely essential in an in-person setting. I cannot tell you the number of times I have heard a presenter say, "Oh, I don't need that. I have a loud voice." No, just no. This is not acceptable for people who are hard of hearing. Use a microphone every time, period. This applies to you as an in-person audience member too. When you raise your hand for a question, wait until a conference organizer can get a microphone to you. If there's not a microphone available for audience members, as a presenter, you need to repeat the questions as they're asked into the microphone. Face your audience as much as possible. Don't turn your back to the audience to gesture at your presentation. People should see your face as often as possible. Facial expression is important, and sometimes lip reading is used by folks in the front rows as an optimum means of access. Finally, and on a related note, use gestures with words. Don't use directional cues like this and that. If you're gesturing to something on your screen or to an object in your hand or on the table as a part of your presentation, use descriptive narration. I joked with my colleagues that the motto here is gesticulate and articulate. I don't think it'll catch on, but I was really excited about it. Okay, any questions on the how for being a more accessible presenter? Keep in mind that the tips and tricks I shared here are for being a more accessible presenter are not exhaustive. There are a lot of things you can do to be a more accessible presenter, and my specialty is on the digital content side, but these are just a few to get you started. All right. Well, thank you so much. As promised, you can always reach me at michele.bromley@pdx.edu. That's michele.bromley@pdx.edu. And that information is also in the accessible slide content I shared with you.